The next installment is called The Craziest Day Hike Ever. By the time the news of non-progress had come out in early March, I was becoming quite frustrated. I really wanted closure to this case so I could move on to other interesting things. But as long as there remained loose ends, I felt my mind constantly being pulled back to the puzzle. So on March 23rd, I found myself back at the site, all by myself, on a day hike. It didn't start out to be that way, but that's how it ended up. I had found the hike in via Anvil Canyon in Squaw Spring to be a pretty awful experience and had been interested in finding an alternative route. There's an old blocked off road that runs southerly from Barker Ranch to Wingate Wash that caught my eye. There's also a saddle southerly of Needle Peak that provides a relative low point to head east from this old road into the upper alluvial fan where the Germans were found. Finally, between the road and the saddle, there's an obscure spring which might be able to provide water. My plan was to get out of the house by 4:30 a.m. and drive via Trona and Ballrot to Barker Ranch and do a day hike from Barker Ranch to the spring to check out the water situation. If there was water, I brought along a lot of empty 2-liter bottles to fill for a water cache placed either at the saddle or below it on the easterly side, towards the Germans for future trips. All the while, I was planning on checking the route for viability. I tried not to dwell on how ugly the trip could have become if I had to haul a couple of gallons of water up an unknown canyon. By 8:30 a.m., I had reached Barker Ranch, the starting point. It was my first time here and was suitably creepy, especially solo. I knew the Myers Ranch was adjacent, and sitting on the road I wanted to take in. I also knew that Myers Ranch was still private property, and I wished to avoid trespassing. I was able to find the property boundaries on a BLM road website and plotted a course around it, skirting the property to the north, then dropping back to rejoin the road once east of Myers Ranch. It was a little bit of a pain, but worked okay. It wasn't until well after I did that route that I found out that this was the area Manson and his buddies buried some yet undiscovered bodies. Glad I didn't know that at the time. I made good time and reached the spring about 11 a.m. It turned out the spring was pretty poor, very low flow, and I'd expect it to be at a maximum that time of year, so it would only be getting worse. But I was able to pump about 2 liters, which I viewed as a reserve I could carry for the day. This gave me some options I was weighing in my mind. Leaving the spring, I headed east and upward to the saddle to check out the route. It was really, really bad. Fortunately, I wasn't loaded down with a lot of water, so I reached the saddle just after noon. Looking at my GPS showed the German site was only 2 miles to the southeast, and a non-possible straight line, of course. Given I had a relatively light day pack with extra water, I figured I had just enough time to make the site, spend no more than an hour there, and get back to Barker Ranch by dark. So off I went. Kids, don't try this at home. Since I was approaching the site from a somewhat different direction, I began searching as I approached, but found nothing new. I was interested in how good a job the sheriff's staff did in retrieving items on December 29th, and it was really very good. There wasn't a sign of bones anywhere, and almost no evidence of any sort of visitation. There were just a few bits of surveyor tape flagging in some bush, but there wasn't anything obvious there. I did notice that all the new spring growth now present made it very difficult to see around the base of shrubs. I was getting close to my must-leave time and started to pack up near the area the wallet was found when I saw a glint on the ground. It was a pair of Bausch & Lomb Killer Loop sunglasses, somewhat crushed and with the lenses missing. They were very hard to see. In fact, when I went to my pack and returned with my camera and measure, I had trouble finding it again. I thought about bringing them back, but figured it best to flag the spot and leave the glasses in place to be retrieved by some future official search team. Again, I finished that and was preparing to leave when about 10 feet away I saw a couple of cards in the dirt. They were smart cards for a German health insurance plan, one with Cornelia's name and the other with Max's name. As I took more pictures, I was really having second thoughts about leaving this stuff, as I was flagging it very visibly, and I wasn't certain if there would be a team back on site anytime soon, but I flagged the rock and prepared to leave it. Finally, I was past my departure time and had my pack on. As I bent over to pick up one of my hiking poles, there was a glint on the ground right under my nose. It was a set of keys. My first thought was that they might have been van keys, but on closer inspection, they looked more like European house keys. Now I was really in a quandary. There were some significant items accumulated here. I literally paced around for 5 or 10 minutes trying to decide whether to leave it all or take it into the Inyo sheriff. Given that I had marked things really well, they would be wonderful souvenirs should anyone else manage to find the area. On the other hand, it was evidence in a case under investigation and should really be handled by professionals. I finally made a judgment call and decided that if any other hiker had found the stuff, they would have picked it up, carted it out, and given it to a ranger. This way the sheriff would at least have context photos showing the items in place and know that they were handled with care. So the items were carefully wrapped in my jacket and stowed in my pack. Being that far out there solo, even with good gear, plenty of water, and a personal locator beacon, it is still a sphincter tightening experience. It feels like being on the far side of the moon. And always in the back of my mind is the knowledge that if something goes wrong out here, the consequences would be considerable. I was in the middle of a harsh reminder of that, so I was quite happy to leave. I made it back to my truck a little after 6 p.m., managed to get out of Guller Wash before dark, and home around 10:30 p.m. It was one long day. The hiking trip was 17 miles, with most of it cross-country travel. Not something I'd highly recommend. I don't think the route I used is especially useful. While it may be shorter, there are significant altitude gains and losses. Besides, it really sucks. The route in via Anvil Canyon and Squaw Springs simply just sucks, so it's preferable. The next installment is called Up the N3 Canyon, 4/15/2010. As the season progressed, I knew it would soon be too warm in the area to safely explore it, but there was still a mystery to be solved. What happened to the kids, and just how did the Germans get to the location they ended up? I knew that 2 of the possible routes into the upper area, what I had taken to call an N1 and N2, had been thoroughly explored and no evidence of the Germans' passage had been found. But N3 was supposed to have been covered by the team that ended up getting sick, lost, and requiring assistance during the big search, so it never really was examined carefully. This seemed like a good candidate for a last exploration before warmer temperature arrived and the weather door slammed shut. I enlisted one of my RMRU teammates, Pete Carlson, to join in the fun. Pete has a sick idea of what's fun. The idea was to arrive at the Anvil Canyon trailhead and spend the night, hike in, and spend the night near the head of N3, then exit the area and return home. Pete and I got to the trailhead for Anvil Canyon on the evening of Thursday, April 15th, and spent the night there. We got up early and managed to get started down the trail about 6:45 a.m. on Friday morning. Since there was no water on this route, we carried about 8 or 9 liters each. The idea was that we would leave a couple liters at the junction of Anvil Canyon and N3 for pickup on the return the next day. We wanted to minimize our water load as we climbed the N3 canyon, as it was pretty heavy. We were very fortunate to have turned up into the burro way of thinking and were able to stay almost entirely on well-defined burro trails past the van site, past the bottle bush, all the way to the N3 junction. This saved us a lot of energy, and we made excellent time. I captured the track on my GPS to use on the way out. Since it was good, or rather bad, uphill slog, knowing where the burro trails were would help us a lot, so the GPS track was valuable information. One change I noticed from previous trips was an abundance of spring vegetation. This included vast swaths of yellow wildflowers. While scenic, they were not only obscured the ground when searching, they made the burro trails much harder to follow. Still, the flowers are pretty spectacular. By 9:30 a.m., we had already turned south up N3 and cached our water. Looking over the area, it seemed like N3 would be an obvious choice for someone wanting to head south. The slope is fairly gentle, and it gives the appearance of reaching a crest in the distance. N1 and N2 just aren't as obvious, and someone wouldn't know they were there without a topo map. As we headed up N3, we came upon a number of small cliff faces on the east side which we checked out. In the morning, they would have provided shade, and we were hoping to find a drop fluid container. While N3 is fairly wide, the wash in it is not large, and the most desirable route is pretty plain to see. Pete and I moved up along both sides of this obvious route. The only thing we came across was a fragment of bone that seemed to be too large to be anything but burro. We could also clearly see the green clump of trees at Squaw Spring off to the west. The travel up N3 was turning out to be very pleasant, and I began to see how the Germans could have made it in as far as they did. This route was much easier than any other I had been on. I knew that about 2.2 miles up N3 there was a drop-off into another canyon that drained the upper alluvial area down into Anvil Canyon further east. I had identified that as a possible campsite for this adventure, as it was in the main area we wanted to search. I had also spotted another potential campsite a further 0.4 miles south, if we had energy to get that far. As we gained the head of N3, the canyon widened and flattened, and we could see the drop-off coming up. We got to the edge at 11 a.m. It was an oh my god moment. The drop down into the canyon below seemed huge. Worse than that, the terrain to the south was a maze of colorful mud hills cut by deep ravines. We knew, as happy possessors of a USGS topo map, that the wash below us would eventually lead up to the upper alluvial fan. But everything our eyes told us ran counter to that. It looked like it was just vanishing off into the mountains to the east. It seemed inconceivable that an inexperienced party, tired and with 2 children, would risk a descent into this canyon below with no apparent hope of it continuing south. So we were more than happy to bypass it and continue south to our planned campsite. Then we saw the shinies. Something was glittering below in the wash, like glass. Unable to resolve what it was with binoculars, it meant a personal visit to the bottom was necessary. So we dropped our packs on the rim and started down. When we reached the bottom, we were very surprised. The depth of the canyon was something of an optical illusion. Not bad at all. But without actually doing the descent, we would not have known. The shinies turned out to be very large flakes of calcite-like crystal, which were littering the wash. Spoofed again. Returning back up to our packs, we proceeded south via the most logical route around the convoluted hills. It's not like there were a lot of options. We found if we stayed a bit to the west, we could remain out of the mud hill area, although we were still forced to up and down small ravines. If this was indeed the route the Germans had taken, it clearly would have turned into a nightmare. We reached our intended campsite on a saddle above the mud hills around noon. It was becoming obvious to us that even through the area we had intended to search when drawn on a map was somewhat large, the crazy terrain was limiting potential through routes to only a few areas. We felt that the 2 realistic routes to the south was a higher one to the west, which we were currently on, or along a well-defined wash through the mud hills. We decided to drop our packs at the campsite and continue south with minimal supplies along the higher route, then return to the camp via the mud hills. Losing the heavy, water-laden packs made travel much easier, and we quickly reached the northern edge of the upper alluvial fan. We could see the knoll, which became the final resting spot for the Germans, about 1.1 miles away, almost directly south. We turned easterly and began to drop down into what we observed to be the best choice of washes for returning back toward our camp area. At that point, we spotted something unexpected. In the wash below us was an odd-looking rock pile with a post in it. My first thought was a mining claim, but I had never heard of any mining activity in the area. And old claim markers are usually just rock cairns. Could it be a grave? Not knowing, we quickly dropped down for a closer look. The post was an old 4x4 wooden post with the remains of red paint around the top area. It was set fairly well into the soil with large rocks around it. The rocks weren't holding it up, the soil was. In the slope behind it, there appeared to be evidence of a small prospect, so it looked like it was some sort of prospect marker. Set on the rock pile was an empty amber bush beer bottle, which didn't look all that old. Was the bottle left by the Germans? No, it wasn't. Post-trip examination of the symbols and markings on the bottom of the bottle showed that it was manufactured by the Thatcher Manufacturing Company. The company ceased operations in 1985, thus the bottle had to be older than 1985. So while the marker appears old, it must be associated with some type of mining activity. We did come across a few very old rusted cans and a couple of wood pieces nearby, so there may have been a campsite there prior to the area becoming part of the Death Valley NP in 1994. Leaving the mystery post, Pete and I continued down the colorful washes until we returned to the area beneath our campsite. At one point, we passed what we called the psychotic rattlesnake. Now, we never exactly saw this sucker. We were at least 100 feet away, which is a good distance when around rattlesnakes. Yet this guy set off his rattle like he was on speed and wouldn't shut up until we were way down the canyon. After a painful but short climb, we reached our gear around 2:30 p.m. We were now faced with the situation of having covered most of the area we needed to be covered, yet it was still very early in the day. It was going to be a long time until nightfall. After a bit of discussion, we decided we had enough energy left to make it back to the truck before nightfall. Part of our optimism was having the burrow trails mapped out in my GPS, which would save a lot of energy on the return. So after shoveling in more food and guzzling down our now abundant water, back north we headed. Even though we were descending, the temperature had gone up and we were now in the heat of day. It was probably in the mid-80s. Since we no longer needed to stop by our water cache at the Anvil Canyon N3 junction, we were able to veer to the NW directly to Anvil Canyon and save some distance. Connecting back to the burrow trails along Anvil Canyon really saved our bacon, as we were both pretty beat. We arrived back at the truck just before 6 p.m., probably more dead than alive. It looks like the total distance for the day was 19 miles, most of which was with a full pack. Not a good idea, but then so many of my experiences in this area have turned out to be not good ideas. After cleaning up a bit, we made it back to the main valley floor just as it was getting dark and blasted off for home. After having hiked the N3 route and taking in the topography, I think it's most probable the Germans used N3 to head south. From the perspective of Anvil Canyon, it appears an obvious choice, and is the route you would see from the vantage point of the Bottle Bush. It's not until you are over 2 miles in and heavily committed to the choice that you discover about 1.5 miles of mud hill hell awaits. But somehow the Germans made it through that, since we know where they ended up. There probably isn't much benefit in additional searching in the N3 area, as Pete and I covered it fairly well. About a month later, in the first week of May 2010, I received a call from Deputy Winkler with some good news. Further forensic work was able to find some viable DNA deep in one of the recovered bodies. They were able to match that DNA to Egbert with a very high level of confidence. Unfortunately, no further DNA progress had been made on the female skeletal remains, and no evidence of child bones had yet been found. They were still out there, somewhere.